one thing that our house didn't have was my parents had opted out of having a telephone in the house. Not that it was, any specific choice necessarily. It was just we lived on the other side of the county line. We didn't have anybody that we could call that wasn't long distance for the most part. So the nearest telephone was about 2 miles down the road at my grandmother's house. Um, and so if I ever wanted to call a buddy after I came home from school and ask them if they wanted to come over for a sleep out or a sleepover, or if I wanted to call my buddy Nick and see if he wanted me to come over and play Mario Kart on his new Nintendo, I would have to make this trip down to my grandmother's house. Um, and I remember specifically, I had a horse at this time. I had this pony. I had this really ornery, wild little paint pony that was super chubby. That was just really kind of a menace. Um, and so I made that trip a couple times on that horse, but I more often than not I'd get about halfway down there, and she'd either try to throw me off and then run into a field, and I'd have to walk home, or she would turn around and try to bite me in the leg. So most of the time I would just opt to make the walk. Uh, and it was about I was small, so it was about a 40 to 50-minute walk. I mean, it just really depended on how much I wanted to stop at the creek and pick up rocks and look at bugs and do whatever. But it gave me a lot of headspace to consider what I was going to say. It gave me a lot of time to walk and think about my friend that I was going to call and what I wanted to say to them. And it was still a long distance phone call, so I only really had 2 minutes to be on the phone, so it had to be concise. Um, and so, uh, I think about that fondly now because the world we live in now, it's almost unthinkable to have to put in that much effort to make a phone call. And because of that, I feel like we take for granted how wonderful it is to be able to reach someone like that. Um, and that headspace that I was able to give to that time that I to go and make that phone call made that phone call really, really a lot more powerful and a lot more important. Um, I think I've been thinking about that a lot and just how that relates to today and how that relates to just being able to break down, um, how interconnected we are right now. Um, the other thing that the Bohalls were deeply involved in was woodworking. So um, this is a picture of some of the Bohalls that were basket weavers out in Brown County. Um, the Bohalls in my direct family, my great grandfather and his grandfather worked at Orinoco Furniture Factory in Columbus, which is the building is still there today. Um, my father was a furniture builder, and he also built hammer dulcimers. And my mother is a beautiful artist as well. So I had a lot of creative woodwork and just creativity in my life. I had aunts that were toy makers and wood carvers. Um, so it was really prominent in my life when I was growing up. And by my late teens, early 20s, I was getting more serious about doing my own work and getting serious about kind of defining what that looked like and what it was to me. By my mid 20s, I had started a side business out of the woodwork and was getting more serious about the future of what that looked like for me. Um, and by my late 20s, a friend of mine came to me and proposed a trip to Southeast Asia that he was an engineer. He'd been an engineer his whole life, and he had just reached a breaking point where he had realized he had decided to do something based on what other people wanted him to do. And he said, I've always wanted to study yoga. I really want to go to India. Do you want to come with me and we'll go on this trip together? And I said, yeah, I've always wanted to go to Vietnam. So let's try to bridge the gap. So let's fly to India, we'll stay there, and then we'll ride our bikes to Vietnam. Um, which was like probably pretty naive. But I felt like we believed that we'd make it happen. It would work one way or the other. But um, that trip was really super pivotal for me. And largely because it gave me a huge amount of headspace to think through what the next stage of my life was. There were days that we would be on the bike before the sun was up, and we would ride until it was time to have dinner, and so we'd be on the road 7 or 8 hours. And that amount of time, I just was constantly thinking through, what does this next stage of my life look like? What is um, this livelihood I want to create for myself? How do I think I'm going to be able to go about doing it? And it was powerful to be able to be given that freedom to just sit and think for so long. And it was deeply meditative. But also during that time, we were in this world of woodwork that I had never really experienced before. In Asian countries, a lot of the buildings are constructed by hand tools, and they're hundreds of years old, older than most things we have around here. And a big part of my thought process while I was on the road was, all of my tools are rudimentary. If I start this business, how am I going to develop, my better tool system? I'm going to need this and that. Um, so I felt like my tools are a little too rudimentary. But while I was there, I was so struck because these buildings had been made with the most basic tools, chisels, hand saws, and they were deeply complex. The outsides of the buildings would be super simple in some cases, but if you looked inside, even elaborate, and so much detail and complexity was put into this one joint. And in some cases, it was put together with a pin so that it could be taken apart, and you'd knock one pin out and the whole thing would break down. And they were preparing for that future of when it needs to be repaired. So these buildings are repaired and stand for centuries. It's incredible. So I just couldn't stop absorbing that. When I came back to the city, it was hugely in the forefront of my mind of what I wanted my work to present. And that Eastern joinery became a really big part of where my focus was on my work. Um, so Bohall Design and Fabrication, our furniture company, is really based around sort of a modern minimalist design normally. Um, and that for me, it allows the more subtle elements to come through. And I think one of the biggest things is I work a lot in wood, and wood used to be a living thing. It is such a beautiful natural element. So we avoid using stains, we avoid doing elaborate carvings or anything like that, because ultimately the star of that piece should be the natural elements. It should be the wood, the live element that, is at the forefront of the whole material. So making the material the star of the work, I think, really comes through when the design and the shape itself is simple and subtle. Um, and then the other element that we focus on is construction. I think that's a big, if I'm going to do a detail, I want it to be a detail that inspires you to question how something was put together. Um, we live in a really modern age, so most of our work goes through a digital process at some point in time. It's the only way we can kind of communicate it with everyone who's doing the work, to create images so people can see what it's going to look like before we even start a process. Um, but digital designing has a lot of constraints. It puts you in a position, at least me, in a position where I will bend my design idea to fit my knowledge of a design program. And that feels like the ultimate end goal becomes a little untrue to the original idea. And so for me, pencil to paper is still the way I want to do the work to get started on a project. I think it's so amazingly wild how we spend our whole lives experiencing nature and seeing nature. We see grass, we see flowers, we see these things, and it ingrains in our brain these shapes that happen naturally, that are just in the world, that we've been seeing for generations and generations. And that's why, artists use things like the golden ratio and the Fibonacci scale to design around what basically is just natural form. And it's pleasing to our eye because it's been there forever, since before we were born. And so pencil to paper, for me, allows me to make a curve and make a curve and make a curve and erase it, and just continue to do it over and over again until the shape is just what feels right. And that feels like the truest form. And for me, that feels like putting pencil to paper feels a lot like that walk to the telephone when I was younger. It feels like a longer, it's a longer process. It gives you more headspace to reach that final goal, and it makes that end piece that much more meaningful because you took the long way to get there. But it's a truer form of what you set out to do in the first place. Um, the construction that I mentioned as detail, um, I've got one piece in particular that's pretty close to my heart that I designed for my first house with Lauren Day, the first place that we lived together. Um, we needed an outdoor table. And so I designed this, which I call the Halley table. Um, but working in wood it's an interesting medium. It's deeply frustrating sometimes because wood never stops moving. Wood is it was fluid. It doesn't matter how much it's been prepared. It was living at one point in time, and no matter how dry it is or climate controlled the environment is, moisture content will change it. It will always expand and it will always change shape. So working in a medium, especially trying to create a modern design around something that's basically wiggling for the rest of its life, is really tricky. And I find that because that thought has to go into it, this form that may be really simple is a really complexly engineered so that it stays together. And this piece in particular, I wanted to stick around for a long time because it really meant a lot to me. Um, and so, as I thought through it, I thought I want people to see and question the construction. So I want to make the joinery visible. I want people to see it and say, I want to know more. I want to see deeper into this. Why did this happen? Or why did you choose to do that? Um, and so I think that keeping the form simple allows the construction and the mindset to come out a little bit more and allows people to want to focus in on those elements. Um, we also do a lot of metalwork at our shop. And so I wanted that narrative to kind of go through to that sort of work as well. And I sat with our metal fabricator, Derek Crocker, and we talked through some pieces. And more often than not, we try to keep the form simple, but we've recently developed some pieces that we tried to build around more like a more natural form. So using a naturally occurring crystalline shape or a rock formation and building that out of steel. But when it came to the construction elements, we wanted to celebrate that. We wanted to celebrate how it came together. And so we filled all of the joints that brought it together with bronze. And so we have a polished bronze joint. So the real main characteristic or the thing that stands out the most in that piece is the area of construction. Designing in this way really can prove to be a challenge. I think for most people, and I know people that can refine and restrain more than me, but restrain is kind of the ultimate thing that I have to keep bringing myself back to. It's so hard not to want to add a little bit more and like create a little more flourish and like a more standout detail here or there. And maybe 2 weeks ago, somebody reminded me of a quote that I had heard when I was younger that I held on to that made me really excited because it felt like exactly what I needed to hear. And I'd kind of forgotten about it. And then they brought it up to me again. And I thought, that's perfect. That's what I needed to hear right now. And so it's a quote from The Little Prince. And it's perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And it just, things like that help me just remind myself that to stick to that true form of what the original idea was. It doesn't need to be more. Ultimately, throughout all of what I'm trying to say, I wanted to really get my head wrapped around why I've chosen to do that or why I've chosen to make those choices. And I think to me, it really boils down to this idea that I feel like a bit of a steward, or I feel like it is sort of our responsibility to use these materials in a way that tells the story of the material a little bit more, or brings forward more intrigue for that natural element. Um, it's such an amazing thing to be able to utilize local hardwoods, or to be able to utilize these things that have such a deep, rich history. And it just seems tragic not to make that the star of the design, not to make it something that people like look at and really want to know more about the life that that piece lived. And then the other element for me is, the simpler the form, the more that the details that are really minute can stand out. And that feels like a closer connection to me as an artist. It feels like it allows people to understand, or at least want to understand a little bit more about why decisions were made, why joinery was chosen to be done in this way. And most of our pieces have at least one or two things that are still hand carved. It's something that I want to try to maintain through work, is having that element of something that was actually formed by hand, so there's an organic shape somewhere. And for that to be seen and really appreciated, the form itself needs to stay simple. Um, so I think it really boils down to me wanting to communicate more closely with the viewer, and me wanting to tell the story of the natural elements. Um, I'm going to provide you with something that I was inspired by Andrea Watts a couple months ago to do. Um, I don't know if you guys were here for Andrea Watts' talk, but she provided everyone with postcards stamped, and asked us to write a postcard to ourselves and send, and she took them back and sent them. And I didn't think much of it at the time when I wrote the postcard, but about a week later, I really needed some support, and it came in the mail, and I forgotten about it, really. And um, I had written to myself, I'm sure I knew that I needed support already, but I'd written like some really encouraging words to myself. And I don't know why it was so powerful, if the timing was just right, but it was like exactly what I needed to hear. And it was really a wonderful thing to receive in the mail. And it really stuck with me, and I thought about it, and I thought about it as I was just thinking about handcrafting something for someone, and thinking about putting in the time to think about a message that you want to convey to someone. And so I went and picked up a bunch of postcards and postage stamps, and they're out in the front. And I just want to charge you or challenge you to try to carve out 5 or 10 minutes. And I know I feel overwhelmed sometimes with trying to just grasp a little bit of time, but it's so important for you as a person. But carve out just like 5 or 10 minutes to write a simple note to somebody, whether it's a loved one, or someone you miss, or someone you haven't seen in a long time. And just know that that time and that thoughtfulness that you put into that, and just the fact that you're writing something with your own hand and taking the time to make sure that your handwriting is clear enough for them to read, is so incredibly powerful for somebody to pick up and look at, and see that your handicraft is there and that you created something for them. And so I just want to encourage you to take one. If you want to write it right now, that's totally fine. I have a drop mailbox by my shop, so I will take it down there and drop it in the mail this morning. If you need to look up an address, or you want to just hang on to one until the time is right, please just take one with you, keep it with you. Sometimes it's hard to put together an envelope and stamps, and so it's nice to just have it. All you have to do is write the address and send it. So grab one of those on your way out. And I just want to again say how much I appreciate being brought out today to be able to speak to all of you, and how much like love and energy I feel from everybody, and how excited I am to just be able to catch up with you after this. So thank you very much.